70 years ago, archaeologist Howard Carter reacted to his great discovery in the Valley of the Kings as if it was a wonderful and thrilling adventure story, which ended happily with his entry into a lost city of gold. But was the ending really so happy? Today, the story has moved on from romance to a tragedy of international proportions. Howard Carter once wrote that if he hadn't become an archaeologist, he might have become a great detective. Not your Sherlock Holmes sort of detective who makes stunning deductions followed by the casual put-down, "Elementary, my dear Watson," but the sort of detective who painstakingly sifts through all the evidence before arranging the clues into carefully considered solutions. But, as Howard Carter wrote in his book, The Discovery of the Tomb of Tutankhamun, while the results of all this detective work revealed a great deal about what the pharaoh had, they revealed remarkably little about what he did and what he was. Beyond the fact that he was about 5'5" in height, of slight build and between 17 and 19 years old, there was, as Carter sadly concluded, remarkably little to add. Just that he died and was buried here with his treasure. Who was Tutankhamun, and why did he die so young? Did he die of natural causes, or was he perhaps even murdered? In an attempt to answer these and other questions, the body of the boy king was disturbed yet again in the late 1960s for a fresh look at the evidence with the aid of the very latest scientific techniques. The Egyptian government had given permission for one of the strangest post-mortems of all time, over 3,000 years after the death of the victim. In December 1968, Professor R.G. Harrison, a British anatomist who'd specialised in forensic work, and a team of medical scientists reopened the gilded coffin. In chaotic conditions, watched by tourists who couldn't believe their luck, they were to conduct for the first time an X-ray examination of Tutankhamun's pathetic skeletal remains for evidence of his age, his parentage, his mummification, and the cause of his death. Professor Harrison found the mummy laid out on a sand tray exactly as Howard Carter had left it in autumn 1926. And the first thing he discovered was its appalling condition. The mummy had not been rewrapped, though Carter claimed it had been.
The head and neck seems to be separate from the remainder of the body. This, I would presume, is preservative material.
Carter and associates had, in their excitement, literally torn the boy king apart, sometimes with considerable force. The pharaoh's head, limbs and torso had all been broken off, his ears had been snapped in half, and his erect penis was missing. Close scientific study of Tutankhamun's blood group suggested that he belonged to the inbred family of the pharaoh Akhenaten. Tutankhamun may well have been Akhenaten's son and his son-in-law, both at the same time, because Tutankhamun married his own half-sister. Inbreeding of this kind was in fact not uncommon in ancient Egypt. The word mummy is derived from the Persian word for resin or bitumen. Professor Harrison's X-ray examination revealed some of the secrets of how resin was injected into the skull during the mummification process.
What probably happened was an instrument was passed up the nostril into the nose and then perforating the top of the nose. This has dislodged a small piece of bone from this region of the skull, And the piece of bone can be seen here quite clearly. Following this, the resin was introduced, and we can now see its presence indicated by this opaque shadow. One interesting feature to note is that there are obviously two fluid levels of the resin, suggesting that perhaps when the resin was first introduced, the head was in this sort of position, vertically backwards, so that when the resin was introduced, it sank to the lowest part of the skull, and then eventually the body was laid horizontally so that the other fluid level was achieved. This region of the skull is also interesting in that it shows us the wisdom teeth in process of being erupted. And this, of course, puts the age of Tutankhamun at death in the range 18 to 20. And other features that we can see in examination of the remains of Tutankhamun also confirm this age at death. If we look at the X-ray of the chest of Tutankhamun, we can also see that the vertebrae in his backbone are quite normal. And if one examines the top and bottom of each vertebra, one can see that there is a very dense line indicating the integrity of this part of the vertebra. This is the first thing to be destroyed when a person has very severe TB. This would indicate that Tutankhamun did not die from severe TB, as some people have thought.
Harrison found a vital clue about the cause of the young king's death in the fragile area of bone at the base of the skull.
This is within normal limits, but in fact it could have been caused by a hemorrhage under the membranes overlying the brain in this region. And this could have been caused by a blow on the back of the head, and this in turn could have been responsible for death.
So, was it murder, with King Tutankhamun killed in some political coup or palace intrigue? Or did he bang his head in some accident, perhaps falling from his chariot while hunting? Even after the post-mortem, the case remains unproven. Finally, the royal body, or what was left of it, was reassembled on its sand tray and put back. Today, the boy king's pathetic remains lie back here where he was buried over 3,000 years ago, the only pharaoh in the Valley of the Kings to rest where he was supposed to rest, and where the high priests intended him to rest for all eternity, in his gilded outer coffin. And what of recent developments in the story of the excavation and the treasures? Well, Howard Carter has been transformed into Indiana Jones, American archaeologist and raider of the lost tombs. The curse lives on in late-night horror movies and videos and computer games called Toots Revenge the world over. And as for the treasures, well, they're still in the museum in Cairo. The Egyptian Museum Cairo was designed by the French in 1902 and has long outlived its usefulness as a workable museum. It's recently been described as a dusty relic of colonialism and the world's worst display of the world's finest treasures. The contents of Tutankhamun's tomb are still exhibited in display cases dating from Howard Carter's time, with labels you can hardly read, in an atmosphere more akin to a railway station than a national museum. There's no humidity control. Internal pollution levels are 80% of those outside. The roof leaks, and some of the cases are buckling under their own weight, like this one above the Great Golden Shrine. Exhaust fumes from the gridlocked city centre traffic just outside are eating away at the gilded surfaces. We found evidence of water leaking through an open window onto a display case below, which in turn was leaking onto the magnificent jewellery once worn around Tutankhamun's neck. If anyone tried to move this piece, it would now disintegrate. For many years, there's been talk of a refurbished gallery or an extension or even a special new museum. It's become a race against time. Meanwhile, despite the display, the sheer quality of the exhibits continues to stun the international tourists who visit every day.
What can I say? The most beautiful thing in the world.
You get a funny feeling, I did anyway, just looking at the things.
So impressive, I can't believe it.
Oh, it's beautiful. Yeah, it's just great.
What I especially loved was all the jewelry and the necklace and everything.
It's amazing and it's unbelievable.
We got permission to go behind the scenes to the cramped conservation department of the museum to see for ourselves urgent repair work on two of the best-known treasures of the tomb. One is the wooden mannequin figure, which is also a portrait bust of the king himself. The sculpted plaster on his face is deteriorating fast.
To protect this collection, we need a lot of time and a lot of patience because every object should be looked again let's say every 5 to 10 years. Because they are in a different context, the humidity is much more higher in Cairo than in Luxor. Besides the fact the pollution is everywhere. We work very quietly. We have certainly among the best restorers in the world, and we don't make such publicity about it.
The decay of the treasures is bad enough, but on this occasion, from what we saw, the remedy was to be even worse. A thin layer of soluble adhesive is being applied with a hypodermic needle between the plaster and the wood. The plaster is pushed back in place, but it cracks under the pressure. Things go from bad to worse as the conservator tries to save the situation. In the course of 2 minutes and with the best of intentions, more damage has been done than in the last 3,500 years. Multiply that by the sheer number of antiquities and monuments in Egypt, and you have a crisis. We put this to the man responsible for administering all Egyptian antiquities, Dr. Mohammed Ibrahim Bakr.
Egypt is a very big museum. Whenever you go, you find monuments. And because of this richness, we cannot deal with all the objects which appear even suddenly or sometimes by excavation. We have sometimes to cool up and cover some of these excavations for a while till with sand. And you know, our country is dry, and the weather can preserve the monuments better than we can now.
With more and more antiquities and more problems associated with them, are we talking about a crisis as major as, say, Venice in peril?
We cannot bury our heads in the sand. We will not wait till we reach a crisis. We have to deal with the monuments now in the very quickly. Otherwise, we will lose a very good part of our human heritage. I would like to tell you something. The rush of the tourists is now gives us another problem.
Every year, well over 1 million tourists come by trains and boats and planes to converge on the Valley of the Kings and to see for themselves the tomb of Tutankhamun. First, they must run the gauntlet of local entrepreneurs who depend on the visitors for their livelihood. Unwittingly, the tourists are about to add to the destruction of the very things they have come to see.
Everything for nothing.
Their perspiration will raise the humidity levels in the tombs they visit. The roar of their tour buses, the crunching of gravel under their feet, and even their excited conversation as they discuss whether they've bought something really old or not, will unsettle the ancient stones. Some of them will brush or lean against walls and columns, clamber over picturesque ruins for photo opportunities. Some will even urinate in the tombs and carve their names to mark the fact that they've been there. As a result of 70 years of this, since Howard Carter made his great discovery, when the tourists reach their destination, there will be little for them to see. The tomb of Tutankhamun, still advertised in brochures worldwide, has been closed to the public for nearly 3 years. We invited Dr. Shawki Nakhla, who directs conservation throughout Egypt, to show us inside the tomb exactly why.
When we came here, we noticed that the number of visitors is a very large number, about 3,000 to 4,000 a day. This means that we have a lot of water vapor, carbon dioxide, and dust, which are precipitating on the walls of this tomb. And we noticed there is something wrong. What about these spots? And we took samples and we analyzed them in the university at Cairo. And then we found that there are many microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, which are very active. Then, what can we do for this tomb? If we leave it like that, perhaps we'll lose all the paints on it one day.
In what ways do you think the international community can help? Is it expertise or finance?
No, what we need, training of young Egyptian conservators and restorers, that's very important. We need materials. This is because we don't have a market for restoration materials in Egypt. We import everything from abroad. We need knowledge and experience in restoration for this material, because most of these materials are new materials, and we can't use any material like that for the restoration of a monument without having a lot of experience behind.
Are the problems here characteristic of other tombs in the Valley of the Kings?
We have problems in all the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, and we need the help of the international community in this field, really.
Help is certainly needed. But the problem goes well beyond tourists and treasures. The very structure of the tombs themselves and the increasingly unpredictable geology and climate of the Valley of the Kings, everything from flash floods to earthquakes, are beginning to make the entire sections of the necropolis unsafe. The fate of one of the most popular and beautiful tombs of all, the richly decorated tomb of the pharaoh Seti I, who ruled Egypt a quarter of a century after Tutankhamun, shows the shape of things to come. When the tomb was first opened in 1817, the colouring of these figures was just as fresh and as brilliant as the day they were first painted. And even today, above the height of human visitors, we can still see something of that freshness and their three-dimensional quality when captured in the light. But up to 7,000 visitors a day used to come into this tomb during the holiday season, and below the visitor level, the reds and the whites and the yellows have been progressively rubbed away. Now that's bad enough, but above our heads, where the famous ceiling was painted with the stars of a night sky, there's been an even greater disaster. In the late 1980s, 3 square meters of plaster fell down. The consequence of increasing humidity and geological movement in the mountains above, followed by further roof falls 2 years ago. The result, currently being examined by conservators at Cairo University, is that this magnificent tomb of Seti I is now closed to visitors, and the burial chamber area may well have to be closed forever. Another tomb in the nearby Valley of the Queens has had a temporary reprieve. But it took 5 years and hundreds of thousands of American dollars to achieve it. The conservation of 150 square meters of exquisitely painted wall reliefs in the jewel-like tomb of Queen Nefertari began in 1986 with an international team of experts led by highly skilled Italian conservators and funded by the California-based Getty Institute. The problem they faced was that water seeping through the limestone had formed salt crystals between the bedrock and the plaster, which in turn had pushed the plaster off the walls and made the paint crack and flake. This was partly because of the qualities of the rock itself, partly because of increased humidity throughout the Nile Valley, encouraged by the building of the Aswan High Dam and its unforeseen impact on the local ecology. The only solution was to remove the crumbling plaster section by section and chisel away at each individual salt crystal from the rock, a very time-consuming process. Then they had to cement the sections of plaster back and fill in all the cracks using lime plaster made out of finely ground debris from within the tomb. Lastly, the paintings themselves had to be restored, using watercolours which can be washed off in the future if need be. But instead of applying blocks of pure colour, the conservators painted a series of thin straight lines which are noticeable close up, but which read as paintings from a distance. This was to show which sections had been restored. But even after all this work and expense, the basic problem remains. The limestone will continue to form salt crystals. The tomb of Nefertari has been hailed as a triumph, as well as a model for future conservation projects. But it's by no means certain that it will ever be open to the general public again, and it's just one of the hundreds of tombs in the City of the Dead, so choices will have to be made. What can be saved, and what will have to be lost? Back in London, and the heart of British Egyptology, the key question is, how can anyone, government official or archaeologist, make such agonizing choices? What are the priorities between preserving the greatest hits of Egyptian antiquities or preserving more mundane, or what might seem more mundane artifacts?
In terms of conservation, I think it does need to be decided what is worth preserving and what can't be preserved. Egypt is one large archaeological site. By Egypt, I mean the Nile Valley, the Delta, the adjacent deserts. It's one enormous archaeological site. There's at least as much to come out of the ground as has already come out of that, I'm quite sure. And as a result, we have to be realistic. The resources are not available to conserve and preserve everything. There are far too many antiquities in Egypt, far too many tombs and temples and so on, to conserve them all. We therefore have to establish priorities.
Do you think conservation is sufficiently well resourced at the moment?
Probably not.
And the answer to that?
The answer to that is to gain funds, I imagine, from international bodies, perhaps bodies like UNESCO. Very rich institutions like the Getty Museum, who, to their credit, of course, have already made substantial contributions to the conservation of Egyptian antiquities.
Is there a need for a more coordinated effort amongst the international community of archaeologists?
Each country tends to do its own thing, archaeologically in Egypt. I mean, this has been the tradition. That is not to say that we don't speak to each other, we certainly do. But it's at informal gatherings rather than in a formal committee, let us say. I would say, given that the work done in Egypt is of a good quality, is of a high standard, I think we can, in the future, speak to each other more closely. There are moves afoot to form, in fact, some kind of body that would coordinate archaeological work in Egypt.
If people continue to dig for scholarly reasons, and in doing so enhance the conservation problem, what do you feel about that?
The implication of that question is that we should stop digging. If we stop digging, we will lose important information because things are not standing still in Egypt. Many of these sites are in very great danger from agricultural encroachment, from modern development of various kinds. In an ideal world, yes, we probably would stop, we would conserve, we would record, document and publish what already exists. We can't do that because every day things are being destroyed, for understandable reasons, but they are being destroyed.
The conservation of monuments has been going on in Egypt since Roman times, and a lot of today's problems in fact arise out of yesterday's solutions. Parts of the decaying Sphinx, as recently as the mid-1980s, were reclad with large limestone blocks. But use of the wrong kind of cement caused some of these blocks to crack and explode from their rock base. Other solutions have been tried and failed. Officials have come and gone, but so far no one can agree about what to do. The Sphinx has suffered more pollution damage in the last 50 years than in the previous 50 centuries, and it's become the single most important conservation issue facing the modern world. Should it be restored to its former glory or conserved in its present state? Is it a question of pollution control, or should the 200-foot stone sculpture be encased in its own particular climate? What sort of techniques of restoration and conservation would be most appropriate? A high-level international conference involving over 70 delegates from all over the world recently met to discuss these issues. And in a press conference, which had to be postponed for an hour because of heavy traffic noise on the road to Giza, they announced first that they couldn't agree on how best to save the Sphinx, and second, that they couldn't agree on how long the Sphinx had to last. But beyond these questions, what about the wider political dimension? Like, what right have Western scientists and conservators to lay down the law to the Egyptians about how best to look after their own heritage? And is it their own heritage? After all, Westerners for over 200 years have been using ancient Egyptian artifacts as a way of enhancing the understanding of Western culture. What, to turn the question the other way around, what if the Egyptians ran a high-level international conference to discuss how best to look after the great public sculptures of the West, like Nelson's Column in Trafalgar Square or the Statue of Liberty? The politics of conservation, global culture, Western expertise, national dignity have become very sensitive indeed. And the riddle of the Sphinx, which used to be about the meaning of life, both here and in the hereafter, the new riddle of the Sphinx has become how on earth to prevent that great stone head from collapsing into the desert sand. Minds were concentrated a few years ago when the Sphinx's right shoulder fell off. So the hapless creature is being given another coat of limestone blocks. Smaller ones this time, stuck on with a different kind of cement. Such solutions are unkindly known in the trade as instant archaeology. They raise the big question, who should take responsibility? Since ancient Egypt is now seen as the origin and crucible of Western civilization, are monuments such as the Sphinx part of a national or an international heritage?
I'm very worried by the word heritage. When I hear the word heritage, I reach for my gun, because it is such an exclusive idea, the idea that some people don't have this and we do. I feel unhappy with it. And so I think that Egypt is really part of us all, so that I feel that the preservation of objects in Egypt is something of deep concern to all of us, and not just to Egyptians. It's concern to people of Western Eurasia and Africa, because it's part of, it's played a central role in the formation of all of our cultures.
One area of sensitivity where this conservation issue is concerned is that some people in Egypt embrace international help, thinking they need as much technical assistance as they can get, while others see it as a covert form of colonialism and really feel that they should look after their own problem.
Egypt is not a rich country, and I think that other countries ought to contribute to it. Now, whether this should be done through Egyptian organizations so Egyptians can control, that seems to me a good idea. And I can see the reluctance of Egyptians to hand over control of large parts of their territory and material possessions to foreigners for even the best of purposes, for preservation. So that, I think, has to be handled very delicately.
The people best placed to tell us about such delicate negotiations are the London architects who attended that inconclusive conference in Cairo. The conservation practice has recently been asked by the Egyptian government to come up with a plan to redevelop the area surrounding the pyramids and the Sphinx. This isn't just a technical problem, but a human one as well.
The material of the Sphinx is deteriorating more rapidly than it has done before. There is nothing inherent in the material of the Sphinx which has changed, so it must be factors in the environment which are causing it. And those clearly are to do with the numbers of tourists, the urban encroachment from Cairo, which is now surrounding it, the buses, the air pollution, and so on.
Usually when you see pictures of the pyramids and the Sphinx, it's sort of completely isolated from the environment that surrounds it. But these panoramic pictures give a very good idea of both the environment and presumably the social problems in handling it, because, okay, we've got rubbish tips here, we've got drain pipes here, we've got traffic here. I mean, these are all kind of human things that you can't just wish away.
I think it's part of the conflict between taking a World Heritage site that is always going to attract growing numbers of tourists. In fact, is attracting growing numbers by a matter of government policy to increase their overseas tourism. And we know all over the world that monuments are actually being destroyed by the very pressures of tourism. What we have to do is put together programs of sustainable management. How can you defuse this?
I mean, how can you diffuse it? That sounds very simple, but of course sometimes it requires moving entire communities and putting a ring fence around objects and so on, which is obviously a major kind of social decision. What exactly is your plan specifically, or your draft plan for dealing with these problems?
One of the problems that the Egyptians have is that the urban encroachment, the urban environment has encroached actually upon the archaeology. When people visit this site, they think of the pyramids and the Sphinx. What they don't realise, perhaps the average tourist doesn't realise, that he's looking at an entire necropolis which stretches over 40 miles down the Nile Valley. And buried beneath the village which has grown up around the pyramids are all the original funerary temples, the causeways, the docking places which were on the original course of the Nile and so on. All of that is now buried beneath new settlement. The Egyptian Antiquities Organization and the Giza Governorate would like to remove that settlement.
My God, I mean, you know, talk about a conservation problem. That's, I mean, presumably 50 years ago that wouldn't have been a problem. We just told them to get out. But today, with, you know, participation in design decisions and people actually being asked about where they want to live, that can't be an easy thing to do.
50 years ago it wouldn't have been a problem because the settlement wasn't there. But it certainly isn't an easy thing to do to move a village of that size, if only for the fact that those people are there because they are employed in servicing the tourists. If you were able magically to remove the settlement and put it somewhere else, you would still have a problem of people being attracted to live on the site. Poor people who need to work near the site and need to live where they're working.
The architect's plan involves not only moving an entire settlement, but preventing coaches from driving too close, rerouting a peripheral road, driving the camel rides out into the desert, doing something about the sewage, and building an orientation center to take some of the heat off the actual monuments. Despite the huge social, political, and economic implications, the architect's plan is to go ahead, a hopeful sign for the future. I think it's appreciated that Western expertise is required. Is it sometimes difficult to offer it?
I think it's frequently difficult to offer it. You've got to be very conscious of the local politics and the way that the idea of the heritage fits into national identity. There's no such thing as a black and white situation in this sort of environment. You need to be able to compromise and ensure that you can put together a proposal that is in the best interest of the monument and is also politically achievable, because we're still dealing fundamentally with politicians. And they, just as politicians in this country or in anywhere in Europe or in America, they expect results. And they expect results within a relatively short space of time.
Within their political lifetime.
Oh, yes. And now sometimes that itself raises problems, as I think we're beginning to see at the Sphinx, where results are required very quickly. Every time a large amount of the Sphinx falls off, a senior member of the EAO gets fired. Now, clearly with that sort of pressure on you, they're very nervous about doing anything.
Columbia University in New York is a good place to find out more about the wider politics surrounding the understanding of ancient Egypt in today's world. Professor Edward Said has specialized in studying changes of attitude towards the Arab world in the West.
You've written that the nature of Egyptology is less about Egypt and more about Europe. What exactly do you mean by that?
You go to Egypt, Cairo in particular, and you walk in what is essentially a messy city. I mean, Cairo, to me, is tremendously important and interesting because it is a hybrid. It's an amalgam of about 500 different styles, none of them rationally worked out, but somehow coexisting with all the others, you see. And that image of Egypt is completely lost. Now, of course, you can immediately gravitate out towards the Giza side, see the pyramids and so on, and then go down the Nile in an air-conditioned boat that completely insulates you from the surroundings. So you can do that, and of course tourists are encouraged to do that because the packaging is attractive, and you don't have to make contact with disease and poverty and Islam and Arabs and all that other stuff.
This turning away from contemporary Islamic Egypt in favor of the more distant and reassuring civilization of the ancients was equally characteristic of the 1920s, the time when Tutankhamun's tomb was discovered and when British archaeologists and administrators had so much difficulty understanding the real-life Egyptians of their own day.
Well, they were constructing an ancient Egypt, that is, something that was cut off as far as possible from the modern Egypt that they were trying to administer. And this is a common problem again, that a lot of early 20th century people were puzzled. How could the Italians have produced the Renaissance? How could these inferior people have produced the greatest works of art? And so the modern Egyptians had to be shut away from ancient Egypt. It was also an extremely aristocratic society because the Egyptian remains they were concerned with were those of royalty. And they liked gossip. They liked looking at relationships between various pharaohs and princesses and things like that. And it was very glamorous, and it was also wonderfully illustrated. I mean, you have these wonderful representations of royalty, so you could focus on the upper class, and for upper class Egyptologists living in a great British Empire, this was very congenial. Tutankhamun's tomb had everything. It was, in many ways, the last of the great excavations. Aristocratic patronage, European experts being blatantly colonial, wearing their topees and their white suits and drinking champagne as an Egyptian workman chipped his way through. And I think that since the 1970s, there's been a good deal of nostalgia among Europeans for this heyday of colonialism when whites could rule without self-consciousness. But I think the main thing is that archaeologists now have to work with the local population and can't neglect them or ride roughshod over them in a way that they were still just able to do in the 1920s.
Of course, the thing about the Tutankhamun excavation is that they started digging in 22 under one system, the old veiled protectorate of Britain.
Right.
And by 1925-6, when they got going with the rise of Egyptian nationalism, it was a completely different system. We have a situation today, of course, where ancient Egyptian objects are scattered all over the world, and a lot of them are presenting enormous conservation problems. So where do we go from here?
Once you get past the nationalist issue and sort of phony sovereignty questions, you know, this really belongs to us, bring them all back, that sort of thing. Or the other saying, you know, it's really part of our heritage, we found them, the Europeans saying that. Once you get past that, I think what is really the most important thing would be sort of frank and honest exchanges by archaeologists, you know, not political ones, but about the state of knowledge that exists in, say, Europe and the West generally, and in places like Egypt, amongst Egyptians, on the other hand, and setting archaeology for the first time in the contemporary political and cultural setting. So historically, archaeologists felt they could do anything because they had the protection of the army and the sovereign. Now, I think it would be important for archaeologists exactly to stop isolating themselves and to talk about these issues that have to do with the sensibility of the natives, the place of archaeology in the local life, contemporary, etc., and the state of exchange between the West and a country like Egypt, which is a very complex and interesting subject and can be looked at. It's never done. Instead, you get these polarized and rather stupid, in my opinion, debates.
In her introduction to the book, The Discovery of the Tomb of Tutankhamun, written just 10 months after Howard Carter first opened the tomb, Lord Carnarvon's sister wrote, "A story that opens like Aladdin's cave and ends like a Greek myth of Nemesis cannot fail to capture the imagination of all men and women in this workaday existence." Aladdin's cave had remained undisturbed ever since 1323 BC. Undisturbed, that is, throughout the rise and fall of the Greek and Roman empires, the birth of Christianity and of Islam, the Crusades and the European Renaissance, and the great revolutions which ushered in the modern era. And then, in November 1922, Aladdin's lamp had at last been discovered, causing unprecedented worldwide interest in its mysteries, its treasures, and its art. But Nemesis was bound to follow. First of all, in the symbolic form of Lord Carnarvon's death, but since then in the form of international controversies about foreign archaeologists working in the sands of Egypt, about who is really helping who, about Western versus Eastern philosophy, and about who is responsible for looking after the contents of the cave, now that they've seen the polluted light of day, now that a lot of them are decaying fast. Above all, about cultural colonialism and the question, in the end, of whose heritage was contained within Aladdin's cave. All this as the result of finding the body of a minor pharaoh of the New Kingdom era who died, probably by violence, when he was 18 years old. One of Howard Carter's favorite lines about the discovery came from Pope Pius XII, who said to Carnarvon's sister, "It is not an exhumation, it is a resurrection." The question of what exactly was resurrected when the tomb was opened still remains to be answered. Maybe, in the balance of things, maybe it would have been better if Aladdin's cave had never been found.
At first I could see nothing. The hot air escaping from the chamber caused the candle flame to flicker. But presently, as my eyes grew accustomed to the light, details of the room within emerged slowly from the mist. Strange animals, statues, and gold. Everywhere, the glint of gold.